My golden sisters stole my dog. When I started to develop and succeed, the sisters decided to blackmail me and karma caught up with them. We lived on the north side of Chicago, in this small, cramped apartment. It was supposed to be temporary, or at least that's what my parents always said. They'd moved us there when I was about 5, planning to save up for a house in the suburbs. But we never left. I'm pretty sure my parents were too wrapped up in their jobs to even think about it. My dad worked as a manager at some logistics company. He was gone before we woke up and didn't come back until late at night, sometimes well after we'd gone to bed. My mom? She was a nurse, pulling long shifts at the hospital, working nights and weekends. They worked their asses off. I'll give them that. But what they didn't do was raise me. Or my sisters, for that matter. The ones in charge of me, for better or worse, were my 2 older sisters, Lily and Chloe. Lily was 3 years older than me, and Chloe was 5 years older. You'd think older sisters would be protective, maybe even nurturing. Not in my house. It was more like being thrown into a cage with wolves. They were my first bullies, and for a long time, they were my worst. It started off small. Typical sibling stuff, I guess. At least, I think that's how it started. They'd tease me about stupid things. My hair, my clothes, the way I talked. But then it got worse. A lot worse. By the time I was about 7, Lily and Chloe had made me their personal punching bag. I'm not talking about a playful shove here and there. I'm talking about getting shoved into walls, tripped when I walked by, punched, slapped, kicked, whatever they felt like doing that day. I tried to tell my parents, but it didn't matter. My mom was always too tired to care, and my dad would just brush it off as kids being kids. They had no idea what was really going on. Most of the time, it was like my parents didn't exist. They weren't there for dinner. They weren't there in the mornings. They weren't there when I needed them to step in. So, my sisters got away with everything. And I do mean everything. I'll never forget one afternoon when I was about 9. My sisters decided they wanted to play a game. This wasn't a game. It was torture. They tied me up in the living room with an old jump rope and left me there for hours. I screamed, cried, begged them to let me go. They just laughed, turned up the TV, and ignored me. When my mom finally came home, I was still tied up, sitting there in the middle of the room. Dried tears streaked across my face. And do you know what she did? Nothing. She barely looked at me, like it was just another day. No questions, no concern, nothing. I'm not sure if she was too tired or if she just didn't care. I guess, in hindsight, that was one of the moments that broke something in me. School wasn't any better. In fact, it was almost worse. You see, when you spend your entire life being beaten down by the people who are supposed to love you, you start to act like it. I became quiet, withdrawn, an easy target. Kids at school picked up on it right away. It didn't take long for the bullying at home to follow me into the classroom. There was this one kid, Michael. He was one of the popular boys. Always the center of attention, always in control. And for whatever reason, he decided I was going to be his favorite victim. He called me names, tripped me in the halls, and made sure everyone knew I was the kid to pick on. At first, it was just him, but kids like Michael always seemed to attract followers. Soon, it was a whole group of them. I couldn't escape it. Home was hell, and school was no better. One day, during recess, they cornered me behind the basketball courts. Michael was there, of course, grinning like a predator. He pushed me into the fence, hard. I hit my head on the metal, and I felt this sharp pain. But what hurt worse was the humiliation. There was a crowd of kids watching, and no one said a word. No one helped. I was just this weak, pathetic kid that no one cared about. I tried to hide all of it from my parents, but looking back, I don't think I needed to. They wouldn't have noticed either way. I once came home with a black eye, and my dad barely glanced at me before going back to reading the newspaper. I guess he was too tired from work to notice, or maybe he just didn't want to deal with it. Either way, I was invisible. The thing with my sisters, though, was that they weren't just physically abusive. They got into my head. They'd play these awful mind games, constantly telling me I was worthless, that no one would ever care about me. I started to believe them. Why wouldn't I? My parents didn't care. My teachers didn't care. No one at school cared. I remember one night when I was about 11, I overheard my parents talking. My dad was going on about how proud he was of Lily and Chloe. "They're such strong girls," he said. "We've done a good job raising them." I almost laughed. Was he serious? They were monsters. But I guess he didn't see it. No one did. The thing that really broke me, though, was when I was about 12. It was one of those hot, humid Chicago summers, and I'd spent most of it trying to avoid my sisters. I had this small, dingy room in the back of the apartment, and I'd hide in there whenever I could. But one afternoon, Lily and Chloe decided they were bored and wanted to torment me. They burst into my room, laughing. Chloe had this weird, twisted grin on her face, and Lily was holding something behind her back. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. "Want to play a game?" Chloe said, her voice sickly sweet. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, hoping they'd get bored and leave me alone. But they didn't. Instead, Lily grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the room. I tried to fight her, but she was stronger than me. They dragged me down the hallway, laughing the whole time. I remember feeling this cold dread settle in my stomach. I knew whatever they had planned wasn't going to be good. They took me into the bathroom and locked the door behind them. Then, Lily pulled out this old pair of scissors. My heart started racing. I had no idea what they were planning, but I knew it wasn't going to end well for me. "We're going to give you a haircut," Lily said, grinning like she'd just come up with the best idea in the world. I begged them not to. I was crying, pleading with them to stop, but they didn't care. Chloe held me down while Lily hacked away at my hair. It was uneven, jagged, and horrible. When they were done, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. I looked like a joke, and they knew it. When my mom came home that night, I tried to show her what they'd done. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally care. But all she said was, "It'll grow back." And that was the end of it. No punishment for my sisters, no consequences, just another day in my life. I started spending more and more time outside the house after that. I didn't want to be anywhere near Lily and Chloe, and I couldn't stand being in that apartment. I'd wander around the neighborhood for hours, just trying to stay away. Sometimes I'd go to the park and sit on the swings, watching other kids play with their families, wondering what it would be like to have a normal life. One afternoon, I decided to explore an old alley near our apartment. It was dirty, filled with trash and graffiti, but I didn't care. It was better than being at home. As I was walking, I heard this soft whimpering sound coming from behind a dumpster. I hesitated for a second, but then I walked over to see what it was. I found a tiny, shivering puppy. It was filthy and looked like it hadn't eaten in days. My heart broke for the little thing. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just leave it there. So, I picked it up and took it home. When I brought the puppy into the apartment, Lily and Chloe were sitting on the couch, watching TV. They didn't even look at me. I went straight to my room and closed the door, trying to keep the puppy quiet. I named him Max, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a friend. Max was the only one who didn't hurt me, who didn't make me feel worthless. He was my secret, and I kept him hidden from my sisters for as long as I could. But nothing good lasted long in my life. One day, Chloe found Max. I was at school, and when I came home, she was standing in the living room with him, grinning like she'd just discovered some great secret. "Where'd you get this?" she asked, holding Max up by the scruff of his neck. I panicked. I begged her to leave him alone, to give him back. But she just laughed and tossed him to Lily, who started tossing him around like he was some kind of toy. I was screaming, crying, begging them to stop, but they didn't care. Max was whimpering, and I was terrified they were going to hurt him. And then it happened. Chloe threw Max a little too hard, and he hit the wall. He let out this awful yelp, and then he just stopped moving. I ran over to him, hoping he was just knocked out or something, but he wasn't. Max was gone. I lost it. I started screaming at my sisters, hitting them, punching them, anything to make them feel the way I did. But they just pushed me away, laughing like it was all some big joke. When my mom came home that night, I told her everything. I thought for sure this time she'd do something, but all she said was, "It's just a dog," and went about her evening like nothing had happened. I buried Max in the backyard the next day. I did it alone, without anyone knowing. It felt like I was burying the last bit of hope I had left. After everything that happened in my childhood, getting out of that house was the only thing that kept me going. I didn't have much of a plan after high school, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't go to college, didn't have the grades or the money, but I managed to land a job as a stock clerk at a local grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. The first few months on my own were a strange mix of freedom and anxiety. On one hand, I finally had some control over my life. I didn't have to deal with Lily and Chloe anymore, and I didn't have to worry about my parents ignoring everything that went wrong. But on the other hand, I was terrified. I had no idea how to take care of myself. No one had ever taught me how to handle money, cook a proper meal, or even take care of my own mental health. I was on my own, for real this time. My apartment wasn't much better than the one I grew up in. It was a tiny, one-bedroom unit in a rundown building on the edge of Chicago. The walls were paper-thin, and I could hear my neighbors arguing or partying late into the night. The heat barely worked in the winter, and the cockroaches seemed to outnumber the people living there. But it was mine, and that meant something. At work, I mostly kept my head down and did my job. The other guys who worked in the store were nice enough, but I didn't feel like I fit in with them. They were all pretty much the same. Guys who'd grown up in the neighborhood, gone to the same schools, and now spent their nights drinking at the same bars. I wasn't like that. I didn't drink, I didn't go out, and I didn't trust anyone enough to get close to them. So, I did my shifts, collected my paycheck, and went home. But I was determined to change. I was tired of being the quiet, invisible guy. Tired of feeling like a victim. I had no idea how to do it, but I knew I needed to take control of my life, and I thought maybe getting in shape would be the first step. One night, after work, I walked past a gym a few blocks from my apartment. I'd passed it 100 times before, but for some reason, that night I stopped. Through the windows, I could see people lifting weights, running on treadmills, and working out like they had their lives together. I hesitated for a moment, then went in. The place was small and gritty. It wasn't one of those fancy, high-end gyms where everyone looks like they just stepped out of a fitness magazine. This place was raw. The equipment was old, the floor was worn out, and there was a permanent smell of sweat in the air. But the people there were serious about their workouts, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in the right place. I signed up for a membership that night, and the next day, I started going after my shifts at the grocery store. At first, it was brutal. I was out of shape and had no idea what I was doing. But I stuck with it, mostly because I didn't want to go back to my lonely apartment and face the silence. The gym became my escape. That's where I met Marcus. Marcus was one of those guys who seemed to live at the gym. He was in his mid-30s, built like a tank, and had this quiet confidence about him. He wasn't one of the loud, obnoxious guys you sometimes see at the gym, showing off how much weight they can lift. No, Marcus just did his thing, focused, and never caused a scene. After seeing me struggle with a bench press one night, he walked over and gave me a few pointers. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after that, he started giving me advice whenever he saw me. Don't lock your elbows when you're lifting, he'd say. You'll mess up your joints. Keep your back straight on the squats, or you'll throw it out. At first, I was too embarrassed to admit I had no idea what I was doing, but eventually, I just started asking him questions. Marcus never made me feel stupid, and over time, we started talking more and more. Turned out, Marcus had a story of his own. He'd grown up rough too. His dad walked out when he was a kid, and his mom worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Like me, he didn't have a lot of guidance growing up, but he found solace in the gym and eventually started training other people. He wasn't a professional trainer, but he knew enough to help people out, and he saw that I needed it. Marcus introduced me to his friend group, and through him, I met a few more people who, for the first time, felt like my kind of people. There was Darnell, a former high school football player who'd gotten injured and had to give up his dreams of going pro. Then there was Joe, an IT guy who worked out to relieve stress from his high-pressure job. And there was Sarah, a single mom who used the gym as her escape from the chaos of raising 2 kids on her own. They all had their own struggles, their own baggage, but we shared one thing in common. The gym was our sanctuary. Slowly but surely, these people became my first real friends. Not like the fake friends I had in school who would laugh at me behind my back. No, these people didn't judge me for where I came from or what I'd been through. They respected that I was trying to change, and they helped me do it. As I got more serious about my workouts, I started to gain confidence. It wasn't just about getting stronger physically, though that was part of it. I was also getting stronger mentally. For the first time, I had control over something in my life, and it felt good. Marcus became more than just a gym buddy. He became a mentor of sorts. He'd been through a lot of the same stuff I had: abandonment, neglect, and feeling like no one gave a damn. But he'd pulled himself up, and he taught me how to do the same. One night, after a late workout, we were sitting on a bench outside the gym, talking about life. Marcus told me about his dream of opening his own gym one day. Not one of those overpriced, glossy gyms for rich people, but a real gym for people like us. People who needed a place to escape, a place to rebuild themselves. "I don't want it to be just a gym," Marcus said. "I want it to be a community. A place where people can come together, support each other, and get strong, inside and out." His words stuck with me. I realized I wanted something more for myself too. I didn't want to just work at a grocery store for the rest of my life. I wanted to build something, be part of something bigger. We kept talking about the idea, and before I knew it, we were planning. It was crazy. We didn't have the money, the connections, or the business experience, but we had passion, and that was enough to get started. We looped Darnell and Joe into the plan, and soon the four of us were meeting up after the gym, sketching out ideas for what our dream gym would look like. We even found a rundown warehouse on the south side of the city that was up for lease. It was a dump, but we saw potential. The only problem was money. None of us had any real savings to speak of, and banks weren't exactly lining up to give loans to a bunch of gym rats with no business experience. But Marcus wasn't about to let that stop us. He started talking to people he knew, pulling favors, and doing everything he could to scrape together the cash we needed. Slowly but surely, we started getting the funds together. We all chipped in what we could. I sold my car, Darnell cashed out some old savings bonds his grandmother had given him, and Joe took on extra hours at work. Sarah, who'd become a close friend by then, even pitched in what she could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get us started. We signed the lease on the warehouse and got to work. It was a mess: broken windows, leaking ceilings, and rotting floors, but it was ours. We spent months renovating the place ourselves, working late into the night after our day jobs. We couldn't afford to hire contractors, so we learned to do everything ourselves: laying floors, installing equipment, and even patching up the roof. It was brutal, but it brought us all closer together. Finally, after months of hard work, we were ready to open. We called it Iron Sanctuary, and it was everything we dreamed of. It wasn't fancy, but it had heart. The equipment was basic, the decor was minimal, but the people who came through our doors weren't there for luxury. They were there for the same reason we were: to rebuild themselves. At first, business was slow. We didn't have much money for advertising, so we relied on word of mouth. But little by little, people started showing up. At first, it was just friends of friends, but soon enough, strangers were walking in off the street. Some were looking to get in shape, others just needed a place to escape, but they all became part of our growing community. And then, just as things were starting to look up, disaster struck. One night, after closing, I was locking up the gym when I heard a noise coming from inside. I thought maybe someone had forgotten something, so I went back in to check. What I found was a group of teenagers smashing up the place. They'd broken in through the back door and were tearing apart everything we'd worked so hard to build. Equipment was broken, mirrors shattered, and the walls were spray-painted with graffiti. I lost it. All the rage and frustration I'd been holding in for years came pouring out. I charged at them, screaming, but there were too many of them. They swarmed me, beating me down just like the kids at school used to. By the time they ran off, I was bleeding and bruised, and the gym was destroyed. I called Marcus, Darnell, and Joe, and they rushed over. We stood there, looking at the wreckage, devastated. Everything we'd worked for, gone in one night. But Marcus wasn't ready to give up. He looked at us and said, "We're not done. We've been through worse than this. We'll rebuild." And that's exactly what we did. We spent the next few weeks cleaning up the mess, repairing what we could, and raising money to replace the equipment. The community rallied around us, helping however they could. People donated money, time, and even equipment. Slowly but surely, Iron Sanctuary was reborn. After we rebuilt Iron Sanctuary, something shifted. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. Word spread about our gym, and people were starting to take notice. The once quiet and rundown warehouse was now buzzing with energy, packed with people from all walks of life. They weren't just coming for a workout. They were coming for a community, a place where they could feel like they belonged. We had regulars now, people who showed up every day like clockwork, pouring their sweat into the gym just like we had when we built it. Iron Sanctuary had become more than just a place to lift weights. It was becoming a symbol of resilience, and people were drawn to that. For the first time, we started to think bigger. It was Marcus who first floated the idea. We were sitting around after closing one night, the lights dimmed, sipping on protein shakes like we always did, when he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, we could do this again. I mean, open another gym. This place is packed, man. What if we expanded? What if we made Iron Sanctuary a whole chain?" The rest of us, Darnell, Joe, and I, just stared at him for a minute. It sounded insane. We had barely survived the break-in, had just gotten back on our feet, and now Marcus was talking about opening more gyms? "Are you serious?" Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. "Hell yeah, I'm serious," Marcus replied. "Look around. People need this. It's not just about the weights, it's about what we've built here. There's nothing like it in the city, and we've got the momentum. I say we ride it." Darnell nodded slowly, considering the idea. "It's not a bad thought," he said. "I've seen new people come in every week, and they stay. They're loyal, man. If we had another spot, we could double that." I was skeptical at first. I mean, I was proud of what we'd done with Iron Sanctuary, but opening more gyms? That sounded risky, and we weren't exactly rolling in cash. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The demand was there. We had something special, and people wanted to be a part of it. Why not expand? So, we started planning. It wasn't long before we decided to open a second location on the west side of Chicago. We found another warehouse, similar to the one we had on the south side, and we managed to negotiate a lease. This time, though, we had some help. Our community had grown, and several members of the gym wanted in. They saw the potential and wanted to invest. One of those investors was a guy named Ricky. He'd been coming to Iron Sanctuary for about 6 months. Ricky was in his early 40s, a real estate developer who'd made a killing buying up old industrial buildings and flipping them into lofts and condos. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to find in a gritty gym like ours, but he loved the atmosphere. He said it reminded him of the hustle he had when he was just starting out. Ricky approached us with a deal. He'd help finance the new location in exchange for a percentage of the profits. It sounded good on paper, but I was wary. I'd heard enough stories about guys like Ricky, smooth talkers who swoop in, promise the world, and then leave you holding the bag when things go south. But Marcus vouched for him, and eventually, we agreed to bring him in as a partner. With Ricky's investment, we were able to open Iron Sanctuary West in less than 6 months. It was an even bigger gamble than the first gym, but from day one, it was a success. The West Side location drew in a whole new crowd. Young professionals, athletes, and people who wanted the real, gritty experience that we offered. It was different from the chain gyms that dotted the city. We weren't offering luxury, we were offering authenticity, and people couldn't get enough. But with growth came challenges. Managing one gym had been tough enough, but two? It was a whole different ballgame. We had to hire more staff, including trainers and front desk workers, and managing them was no easy feat. We hired a guy named Eric to manage the West Side location. Eric had been a regular at the original gym and had experience running a fitness studio before it went under. He seemed perfect on paper, confident, energetic, and knowledgeable about the business. But I had my doubts about him. Something about Eric seemed off, but Marcus insisted he was the right guy for the job. At first, things went well. Eric managed the gym like a pro, and we started seeing more and more people sign up for memberships. But then things started to unravel. I started hearing whispers from members about shady things going on at the West Side gym. People were getting charged for services they hadn't signed up for, equipment was mysteriously going missing, and Eric was rarely around when problems cropped up. I confronted Marcus about it, but he brushed me off, saying that Eric was just busy and that we were growing too fast to avoid a few hiccups. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, one day, I got a call from Joe. "Man, you need to come down to the West Side gym right now. Joe said, his voice tight with urgency. There's something you need to see. When I got there, the place was in chaos. Members were yelling at the front desk staff, demanding refunds for charges they didn't recognize. The front desk girl, a kid named Tim who just started working for us, looked like he was about to cry. And there, in the middle of it all, was Eric, calm as could be, like he didn't have a care in the world. What the hell is going on? I demanded, walking up to Eric. He gave me this smirk, like none of it mattered. It's just a billing issue, he said casually. We'll sort it out. But it wasn't just a billing issue. As it turned out, Eric had been skimming money from the gym, adding extra charges to people's accounts and pocketing the difference. He'd also been selling off equipment and keeping the profits. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. You think I care about this place? He sneered. It's just a stepping stone for me. I'm moving on to bigger things. We fired Eric on the spot, but the damage was done. It took months to clean up the mess he left behind, and we had to reimburse dozens of members who'd been scammed. It was a huge setback, but we weren't about to let one bad apple ruin everything we'd built. Marcus and I doubled down on managing the gyms ourselves, rotating between the two locations to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. And we were determined to keep expanding. Despite the drama, Iron Sanctuary West was a success, and we started planning our third location. This time, we set our sights on the north side of Chicago, near Lincoln Park. It was a more upscale area than where we'd been before, but we figured there were people there who wanted what we were offering. Real, no-nonsense training without all the fluff. We found another warehouse, bigger than the last two, and got to work. But this time, we did things differently. We brought in more partners, people we trusted, like Sarah, who had been with us from the start, and a guy named Hector, who had been a member at the West Side Gym and had experience managing businesses. Hector was sharp, detail-oriented, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. He quickly became our right-hand man. As we were preparing to open the north side location, we ran into another problem. Ricky, our real estate investor, started pushing us to franchise the gym. He saw dollar signs in Iron Sanctuary, and he wanted to take it national. Marcus and I were hesitant. We didn't want to dilute what we'd built. Iron Sanctuary was supposed to be special, a community. Turning it into some faceless franchise felt wrong. But Ricky was persistent. He even went behind our backs and started talking to other investors, trying to drum up support for the idea. When we found out, it nearly caused a huge blowout. I was ready to cut Ricky out of the business entirely, but Marcus convinced me to keep him on, at least for now. We needed his investment for the third gym, and despite his ambition, Ricky had connections we didn't. The tension with Ricky was growing, but we pushed ahead. The North Side Gym opened with a bang. We had a grand opening party, complete with competitions, giveaways, and free classes. The turnout was incredible. People from all over the city showed up, and we signed more memberships in that first month than we had at either of the other locations. But things were about to take another unexpected turn. One night, about a month after the grand opening, I got a call from Hector. His voice was low and serious. "We need to talk," he said. We met up at the North Side Gym, after hours. Hector had a folder in his hand, and when he opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside were documents showing that Ricky had been siphoning money from the business for months. Just like Eric, he'd been skimming off the top, only this time it was much more sophisticated. He'd been using his real estate connections to inflate our lease agreements and pocket the difference. We were being overcharged on rent, and Ricky was making a fortune behind our backs. I was furious. Marcus and I called an emergency meeting with Ricky the next day, and when we confronted him, he didn't even bother denying it. Instead, he tried to justify it, saying that he'd earned that money by helping us expand and that we wouldn't be where we were without him. "We made Iron Sanctuary what it is," I told him, my voice shaking with anger. "Not you. You don't get to steal from us and pretend it's your right." We cut ties with Ricky that day. It was a risky move, especially since we were still in the early stages of the North Side Gym, but we weren't about to let him take advantage of us any longer. We had to scramble to cover the losses, and it set us back financially, but we pulled through. Despite everything, Iron Sanctuary continued to grow. We didn't franchise the gyms like Ricky had wanted, but we did open 2 more locations, one in the southwest suburbs and another in downtown Chicago. Each gym had its own unique vibe, but they all stayed true to the original vision. A place where people could come to get strong, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Things were finally looking up for me. Iron Sanctuary was thriving. We had 5 locations across Chicago, and I was in the best place I'd ever been in my life. Physically, mentally, and financially. I had everything I could have ever wanted. The business was steady. My friendships with Marcus, Darnell, and Joe had only deepened over the years, and the gym community felt like a second family to me. I had escaped the nightmare of my childhood and built a life that I was proud of. But as they say, your past has a way of catching up with you. It all started when I got a message one evening from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was spam, but something about the wording made me stop and read it. The text simply said, "Asterisk, you owe us." Asterisk, there was no name, no explanation, just those 3 words. A cold shiver ran down my spine as my mind immediately went to Lily and Chloe, my sisters. I hadn't heard from them in over a decade, and I had hoped it would stay that way. But something deep down told me they had found me. I didn't respond to the message, hoping it was some random prank or spam. But the next day, another message came through. Asterisk, we know you're rich now. Time to pay up for everything you owe us. Asterisk, I felt sick. I hadn't spoken to either of my sisters since I moved out all those years ago. They had tormented me, broken me down to nothing, and now they were trying to worm their way back into my life. It didn't take long for me to realize what they wanted. Money? I tried to ignore the messages at first, but they kept coming, more frequent, more aggressive. They didn't come out and say who they were, but I knew. The threats got more specific. Asterisk, if you don't want the world to know the truth about you, you better pay up. Asterisk, what truth? What lies could they possibly have? But I wasn't naive. I knew they could make something up, and with the position I was in now, running multiple gyms and being a minor public figure in the fitness world, the damage could be catastrophic, even if the rumors weren't true. I couldn't let them ruin everything I'd built. I blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, I came home late after closing up the downtown gym, and I noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I cautiously stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. Everything looked fine at first, but then I noticed that my bedroom had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, my clothes were thrown everywhere, and the closet door was wide open. Someone had been inside my home. My first thought was to call the police, but then I saw something that confirmed my worst fear. On the floor, next to my bed, was a small, cheap ring. It was old and scratched up, but I recognized it instantly. It was Chloe's. The police arrived shortly after I called them, but they couldn't do much at first. There was no sign of forced entry, and aside from the mess in my bedroom, nothing was stolen. It looked like a typical break-in, except I knew it wasn't. I told the officers about the threatening messages and how I suspected it was my sister's, but without concrete proof, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to stay vigilant, change my locks, and keep a record of any further contact. It felt like a weak solution, but I had no other choice. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started seeing strange cars parked outside my gym and my apartment, always lurking just long enough to make me uneasy. One night, while locking up the Iron Sanctuary West gym, I thought I saw someone watching me from across the street. A figure in a hoodie, standing still under a street lamp, just staring. I was on edge constantly, but I refused to let it affect my business. I couldn't let them win. I told Marcus, Darnell, and Joe what was happening, and they had my back completely. Marcus even offered to stay at my place for a few nights, just to make sure nothing happened. I appreciated it, but I didn't want to drag them into my family's mess. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was asleep in my apartment when I heard a loud crash. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. Before I could even process what was happening, 2 figures burst into my bedroom. They were wearing black masks and dark clothes, and before I could react, they tackled me to the ground. I struggled, trying to fight back, but they were strong. I caught a glimpse of a ring on one of their hands, a familiar, cheap, scratched-up ring. Chloe. They started hitting me, hard. I felt the familiar sting of punches and kicks, just like when we were kids. But this time, I wasn't the same weak little boy they used to push around. I fought back with everything I had, but there were two of them, and they had the advantage of surprise. They didn't say anything, just grunted as they landed blow after blow. I felt a sharp pain in my ribs and a crack as one of them kicked me hard in the side. I was losing consciousness, but before I blacked out, I heard one of them whisper, "You should have just paid." When I came to, they were gone, and my apartment was trashed again. Blood was dripping from a cut above my eye, and my entire body ached from the beating. I knew it had been them, Lily and Chloe. They had finally taken things too far. I called the police again, and this time, they took things more seriously. The break-in, the assault, and the messages were enough for them to launch a full investigation. I told them everything, about the years of abuse, the recent threats, and how I believed it was my sisters behind the attack. The police combed through the apartment, looking for evidence, and that's when they found it, Chloe's ring. It had slipped off during the struggle and was lying on the floor near the bed, smeared with blood. My blood. They bagged it as evidence and assured me they would look into it. A few days later, I got a call from the detective in charge of the case. They had run tests on the ring and found something even more incriminating, DNA. It was a match for Chloe. They had her, and it wasn't long before they traced her movements and arrested both Chloe and Lily. The trial that followed was surreal. I hadn't seen either of my sisters in years, and now here they were, sitting in a courtroom, facing charges of assault and burglary. They didn't even look at me as the evidence was laid out. My testimony, the text messages, the ring, the DNA. It was all there, plain as day. Their defense tried to paint me as a liar, claiming I had invited them into my home and that the fight was an accident, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury didn't buy it, and they were both found guilty. I can't describe the mix of emotions I felt when the verdict was read. Relief, anger, sadness. It all hit me at once. These were the people who had ruined my childhood, who had come back into my life to try and ruin it again. But now they were gone. They were going to prison, and for the first time, I felt free. After the trial, I tried to move on, but the whole ordeal had left its mark. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, even though I had long since accepted that my sisters were toxic. I thought back to everything they had put me through, the beatings, the torment, the mind games, and now, after all these years, they had tried to destroy me once again, but I had survived. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that your past doesn't define who you are. It's how you respond to it that matters. My sisters may have scarred me, both physically and emotionally, but they didn't break me. They couldn't, not in the end. I'd built something far stronger than anything they could ever tear down. Myself? After their sentencing, I decided to take some time off from the business. The guys had everything under control, and we had built up a solid team of managers and staff. I needed time to reflect, to process everything that had happened. I booked a trip to a small cabin in the woods, just outside Chicago. It was peaceful there, away from the chaos of the city and the constant noise of everyday life. I brought only the essentials with me. No phone, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. During those quiet days, I thought a lot about forgiveness. Could I ever forgive Lily and Chloe for what they did to me? Did I even need to? I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure I wanted to. The scars they left ran too deep. But as I sat there, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and watching the sun rise over the horizon each morning, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It wasn't about letting them off the hook. It was about letting go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. When I returned to Chicago, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I threw myself back into the business, more focused and determined than ever. The guys welcomed me back with open arms, and we quickly got back to work expanding Iron Sanctuary. It wasn't long before another opportunity presented itself. A real estate developer approached us with an offer to open a flagship Iron Sanctuary in one of the city's most prestigious locations, right in the heart of downtown, near Millennium Park. It was the kind of opportunity we had always dreamed of, a chance to solidify Iron Sanctuary as a true powerhouse in the fitness world. It was a big risk. The rent was astronomical, and the space was huge, but we knew we could do it. We spent months planning, designing, and preparing for the opening of what would become our largest gym yet. This wasn't just about expanding our business. It was about making a statement. Iron Sanctuary wasn't just a place for people to work out. It was a place for people to rebuild themselves, just like I had done. The grand opening of Iron Sanctuary downtown was a massive success. We held a huge event, inviting influencers, fitness enthusiasts, and even local athletes to come and check out the space. The energy in the air was electric, and for the first time, I felt like everything had finally come full circle. I had started out as a broken kid in a rundown apartment, tormented by the people who were supposed to protect me. Now, I was standing at the helm of a thriving business, surrounded by people who believed in me. But the most surprising part of that night wasn't the success of the gym or the turnout of the event. It was who showed up at the end of the night. I was standing by the entrance, talking to Marcus and Darnell, when I saw a familiar face in the crowd. At first, I couldn't believe it. I blinked, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. My mother was standing there, watching me. I hadn't spoken to my mother since I left home. After everything that happened with my sisters, I couldn't bear the thought of reconnecting with her. She had ignored everything back then, turned a blind eye to the abuse I had suffered, and I had resented her for it. But now, after all these years, there she was, standing just a few feet away from me, looking fragile and much older than I remembered. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, sadness, confusion, all of it hit me at once. I felt Marcus's hand on my shoulder, steadying me, and he gave me a small nod. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what he was thinking. This was my moment. I walked over to her, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. She looked tired, worn out, as if life had taken a toll on her too. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," she said. I've been following your success. I'm proud of you." I didn't know how to respond. Proud of me? Where was she when I needed her most? Where was she when Lily and Chloe were tormenting me, beating me down day after day? But something in her eyes stopped me from saying anything harsh. She looked regretful, broken, as if she knew she had failed me and didn't know how to make it right. "I don't need your pride, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I needed you back then." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded, as if she already knew what I was going to say. "I know," she whispered. "I know I wasn't there for you. I was too caught up in my own struggles to see what was happening to you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Daniel." I swallowed hard, the weight of her apology hanging in the air between us. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of her finally acknowledging the pain she had caused by not protecting me. But now that it was here, I didn't know what to do with it. "Why now?" I asked, my voice softer. "Why are you here now?" She wiped at her eyes, looking down at her hands. "After everything that happened with your sisters, I realized how much I had lost. I lost you, and I wanted to try, even if it's too late. I wanted to try and make things right. It was too late. I knew that. There was too much history between us, too much damage. But something inside me softened as I stood there, looking at this woman who had given me life but hadn't been able to protect it. "I don't know if we can ever have a real relationship," I said honestly, "but I'm not going to carry this anger anymore. I'm done with it." She nodded, her face crumpling in a mix of relief and sorrow. "That's all I can ask for," she whispered. We stood there in silence for a few moments before she quietly turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't feel a sense of closure, but I felt lighter. Maybe that was the first step. In the months that followed, I focused on what I had built. The gyms continued to grow, and we even started hosting charity events and community outreach programs to help underprivileged kids get access to fitness and mentorship. It felt like everything had come full circle. I was able to use my story, my pain, to help others who might be going through something similar. Iron Sanctuary wasn't just a gym anymore. It was a movement for people to find strength in their struggles, to rebuild themselves from the ground up, just like I had done.